Welcome back to DCB's weekly college football recap. All I gotta say is wow, what an incredible slate of games college football week 3 treated us to. But before we get into all the nail biters that went down on Saturday, let's look back to a couple of earlier games, one on Thursday and a couple on Friday night. Thursday, we had one ACC matchup between NC State and Wake Forest. Early on in this game, it looked like Wake would take control and run away with it. Took an early 14-0 lead based on a kick return touchdown. And then NC State kind of flipped the switch. They really struggled defensively the first 2 weeks and even the first half of this game. But then, like I said, completely flipped the switch in the second half, shut down Wake Forest, and won this game by 10 points. I was pleasantly surprised by that defense, the first signs of life that they've really shown so far in this young season. Moving over to Friday, we had a couple of teams beating up on FCS opponents with Indiana and Syracuse. Don't really need to say much more there. Indiana wins a 73-0 shutout. That was a little bit tough there for the Sycamores. But Houston, probably the highlight of the night. I've been high on the Cougars since the offseason. We are invested in them in multiple ways in the futures market, and it's been a great start to the season for them. 3-0, their defense looks fantastic. I will say there were a couple of drives towards the end of the first half where their main defensive tackle got injured and was on the sideline for a bit. That made a huge difference in allowing Colorado to actually stick in the game for longer than they should have. But once he was able to get back in and healthy, Houston continued to dominate defensively and in the trenches in this one. Connor Wigman, the quarterback, I always thought was more of a pocket passer, but he has really shown some grit so far this year, picking up short yardage and running around quite a bit, adding another element to that Houston offense. There were also 2 late-night matchups on Friday, one between Arizona and Kansas State, another one of these weird non-conference games between conference opponents. This was scheduled before Arizona joined the Big 12, so they just kept it on the schedule. Arizona really dominated this game. I know it was only a 6-point margin, and Kansas State had it tied until late in the third quarter, but really were unable to generate any sort of offense. Only 193 total yards and 88 passing yards. Just a mess over there right now with Kansas State. I made a big mistake backing them in this game and will not be making that same mistake moving forward. Arizona, I've been speaking on them. I think they are a bit of a sleeper team in the Big 12. I wasn't sure what to expect from their defense, but Noah Fafita in his third year as a starter looked decent, and then the run game looked great behind Ishmael Mahdi, and have to be pleasantly surprised by the defense so far as well. Arizona could be a very sneaky team throughout the season in the Big 12. Then, of course, we can't talk about the Friday slate without mentioning UCLA and the absolute dumpster fire that they have become. Coach Deshaun Foster was actually just fired this morning, so UCLA will be moving on sooner rather than later, just 3 games into the season. They took a massive loss at home here to New Mexico, 35-10, and just got ran off of their own field in front of about 15 total fans. New Mexico was able to do whatever they wanted in this game. They ran for 298 yards on this UCLA defense, and the Bruins just refused to make adjustments throughout the game, including just putting an extra defender in the box would have maybe helped. But unbelievably poorly coached team out there with UCLA, and that's ultimately why they decided to make the move that they did today. 13 penalties, including 9 in the first half. Just an absolute dumpster fire in LA. All right, let's move over to the main show, which of course is Saturdays in the sport of college football. We had absolute banger games at all 3 levels of the slate. The early window, there were a ton of blowouts, but one game really stood out in particular, and that was Clemson going into Georgia Tech. Clemson is just not that great of a team. We've said it from the start, knew it going into the LSU game, and nothing has really changed. They have refused to use the transfer portal for whatever reason. Dabo Sweeney just doesn't like to use it, and it's hurt them. They really could have used an upgrade at running back this offseason. They just have not been able to establish a ground game through 3 games, and that's exactly what Georgia Tech does best. Haynes King is an absolute dog at quarterback. Nobody I would rather have in a close game, especially against a ranked opponent. This is Georgia Tech's specialty under Brent Key. He now has the most home wins over ranked opponents of any coach in the country the last 3 seasons. Georgia Tech picks up another one here outright, 24-21 against Clemson with a walk-off 55-yard field goal where they had to rush the kicker onto the field. Just an electrifying game and moment for Georgia Tech. The highlight of the midday slate has to be Georgia and Tennessee, everyone's game of the week there between top 215 opponents. Georgia goes in and ultimately wins this by 3 points in overtime, 44-41. Tennessee had a chance to win this game with a field goal as time expired in regulation and unfortunately missed it. Georgia then takes advantage in overtime, holding Tennessee to another field goal before running in the game-winning touchdown themselves. This was always going to be a shootout, and Georgia definitely has some things to clean up defensively. They have a real weakness at the second cornerback position as well as their second safety, and Tennessee really picked on those guys, especially in the first half, jumped out to a 21-7 lead in the first quarter. And Josh Heupel is certainly back in his bag calling plays for Tennessee now that he feels comfortable throwing the ball deep, which has always been a big part of their offense, but they really haven't had the personnel to do it the last 2 seasons. They feel like they do this year, and they were able to hit some big plays over the top on that Georgia defense. But ultimately, Georgia wins the battle at the line of scrimmage, wins the rushing battle, and ultimately perseveres in this very hard-fought potential game of the year. Now I'm going to come back around to some of the lower tier games here in the earlier windows, but there is a night game that I have to mention up front here as well. Another potential game of the year here between Texas A&M and Notre Dame. This game was absolutely crazy. Pretty much anything you could ask for. This game included it. Big special teams plays. Notre Dame blocks a punt and returns it for a touchdown for the opening score of the game. Texas A&M then responds with an 86-yard passing touchdown. Marcel Reed was inconsistent throughout the game as he was under pressure a decent amount, but in the end he made more plays than CJ Carr for Notre Dame, and Texas A&M wins this game outright on the road with a walk-off touchdown on 4th and 12 inside the Notre Dame red zone. That was just an electric finish to this game, and the Aggies steal one on the road. Notre Dame starts 0-2. I had predicted this, and I still think they probably end up with 9 or 10 wins, but it will now be a very controversial conversation with the playoff committee at the end of the season if Notre Dame is 10-2 with these 2 losses. A couple of other notable early window results at the noon Eastern Time hour. Oregon goes in and takes care of business against Northwestern, 34-14. Bit of a backdoor cover here for Northwestern. Oregon didn't exactly run up the score the same way that they did against Oklahoma State, but they certainly felt like they were in control of the game throughout, and Northwestern just able to put up a couple of scores near the end. Zero concerns for Oregon moving forward. I have definitely upgraded this team since the preseason. Alabama with their second straight dominating win, this time over Wisconsin, 38-14. A little bit more impressive than Louisiana Monroe last week, but we still had some questions about how this team would respond to losing to Florida State to open the season. This is starting to look like the Alabama team that we expected coming into the year. Everyone else in the noon window pretty much took care of business, but there is one team that I have to highlight here, and it's Michigan. Looked completely different without head coach Sharon Moore leading the charge on offense. Completely opened up the playbook and let Bryce Underwood actually do some things with the ball, both with his arm, but also on the ground. Really the first time in 3 games that we've seen designed runs called for Underwood, and he ends up with 114 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns on the ground to add to 235 and another score through the air. He looked fantastic, made one really bad decision throwing into triple coverage, but outside of that, Michigan could not have been much more dominant in this game against CMU, winning 63-3 and outgaining them over 600 yards to 139. One more team that I want to give some praise to before we move into the 3:30 slot. Missouri just continues to roll, showing that the win over Kansas and what they've done so far, certainly not a fluke. They only allowed 2 pass completions in the entire game for Louisiana for a total of 4 yards through the air. Their pass defense has been elite so far this year, both in the secondary, but also their pass rush. Damon Wilson, the edge rusher who transferred over from Georgia, is having a massive impact. And then the transfers on offense as well. Bo Prabula, the quarterback, with another very solid performance. And then Ahmad Hardy might be the best running back in the SEC this year. USC opened their Big Ten schedule with a road win over Purdue. USC wins this game by 16, failing to cover again against a Big Ten team, but really optimistic about them overall for the season, and I really needed to see them close out a game in the Big Ten, regardless of who the opponent was. If we think back to last year when USC was playing their first season in the conference, they had a lead in the fourth quarter in every single game, but ended up with 5 losses. So it was good to see them finish this one out, especially on the backs of their defense. Purdue does seem to be improved defensively themselves, but only able to put up 17 points here and run for 2.1 yards per carry. USC's defense is the strength of their team for the first time in many years. Next, let's talk about the backyard brawl, an old school rivalry between Pitt and West Virginia. This was a game that Pittsburgh really just gave away. They led it 24-14 midway through the fourth quarter. They end up giving up 10 points to West Virginia in regulation and then a touchdown in overtime to lose the game by 7, 31-24. Pitt picked up a number of key injuries in this game as well. Desmond Reed, their best player, all-purpose back, returns kicks and punts for them. He is injured. I'm really hoping it's not a long-term issue because Eli Holstein also went out for a couple of plays. He did return to the game, but certainly picked up a bit of a knock for him as well. And they also lost a starting offensive line. So it just seemed like the entire offense was dropping like flies in this one. Again, just hoping that none of these are long-term injuries because I am very high on this Pitt offense if they can keep everybody healthy. Another game that we need to talk about, which was not on my radar whatsoever. I don't think I even talked about this game in our Saturday morning space, but Iowa State had a true road game scheduled against Arkansas State. Not really sure why they chose to schedule that one, but it was not an easy win here for the Cyclones. They struggled throughout this game, actually trailed 10-9 as we got close to halftime. Ended up pulling this one out 24-16 as Arkansas State was unable to find the end zone in the second half. They were able to hold them to way too many field goals to pull off the outright upset. Still not very high on Iowa State though, 4-0, and they are number 14 in the country. But again, just haven't really been that impressed by what I've seen. The win over Kansas State looks less and less impressive with each passing week. Another team that appears to not be nearly as good as they were projected to be is Texas. We know the defense is fantastic, but the offense is going to be a long-term problem, I do believe. Arch Manning, we know, is the one who gets all of the hate, but if we dig deeper into this offense, they've got a lot of other issues. Trey Wisner was out for this game against UTEP, and CJ Baxter unfortunately picked up an injury as well on his first carry of the game. Both of those guys have really dealt with a lot of injuries throughout their career, especially Baxter. I really feel for that guy. He is a phenomenal running back when he's healthy. But once again, Texas is going to have to try and figure it out now without both of their top 2 running backs. They've also lost so many high-level pass catchers the past 2 seasons to the NFL. Guys like Xavier Worthy and Isaiah Bond and Matthew Golden, the list goes on and on. Their replacements this year are simply not as good, and they really seem to be lacking a lot of speed on the outside. So, as much as Arch Manning gets a lot of the hate, and he did throw another horrific interception in this game, the fact that Texas only scored 27 points, I think, has a lot more to do with the overall composition of this offense. They were very conservative in this game, running it 56 times as opposed to just 25 pass attempts for Arch. I'm really not sure where Texas goes from here offensively. They've got a lot to figure out. Absolutely dominant display by Miami in what was supposed to be a top 20 matchup between them and South Florida. USF was coming off of back-to-back upset wins over Boise State and University of Florida, and it was always going to be a tall task for them to pull off 3 straight, especially back-to-back on the road against teams that are much bigger and more athletic than them. There was no element of surprise here. Miami was fully prepared, and their defense appears to be on a completely different level than last year. North Texas, one of my favorite G5 teams this year. I've been preaching about them as often and as loud as I can to anybody that will listen. Another dominant win here over Washington State, 59-10. This was a pretty close spread, and I saw a lot of people taking the underdog, and it did not work out here. The Mean Green defense and quarterback is such a great combination in the American. We'll talk about a look-ahead line for them for Week 4 coming up. I think there's a really nice spot there. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the performance of Ohio State on Saturday. If you look at the final score, they win 37-9 against in-state Ohio. I'm just not impressed with this team. I know they are number one for most people right now because they beat Texas, but as I just talked about, I'm not really that impressed with Texas either. I think that was more of a fringe top 10 matchup rather than a top 3. This game was just 13-9 midway through the third quarter, and the only reason that Ohio wasn't able to continue competing in this one was Parker Navarro, their quarterback, got knocked out of the game for a few series, and it really derailed their offense. But this was a very competitive game until that happened, and Ohio State offensively, I'm still not fully convinced by. We have a second coach firing to announce here. It's already all over the news, but Virginia Tech, after losing at home to Old Dominion in a really dominant display, ODU jumped out to a 31-0 lead on the road at Virginia Tech. Just a disgraceful performance. They did come back and make the score look a little bit more respectable in the fourth quarter, but Brent Pry, as predicted, he is out of there after Week 3. Another great game in the SEC on Saturday between Arkansas and Ole Miss. Ole Miss announced before the game that Austin Simmons was no longer the starting quarterback. Hard to tell if it was entirely based on injury or just a bit of performance as well, but the backup, Trinidad Chambliss, incredible name and incredible performance. Throws for 353 yards, 1 score through the air, and 2 more rushing touchdowns. He looks to be a pretty dynamic player. It doesn't matter who you stick into that offense for Ole Miss. Whoever plays quarterback seems to be a pretty dynamic playmaker. Same thing for Taylon Green on the other side for Arkansas. It's just clear that he doesn't quite have as much help around him as Ole Miss does. Arkansas certainly had their opportunities in this game, but come up just a little bit short, falling 41-35. Really was a shootout in the first half. I think the total went over just in that first half. Slowed down a little bit in the second, but Ole Miss's defense certainly has some leaks in it as opposed to last year where they were quite dominant. Another team that made a quarterback switch in the SEC on Saturday was Kentucky, and it worked out great for them. Ended up starting local kid Cutter Boley and putting up 48 points in a win over Eastern Michigan. Solid first performance by the sophomore. Sticking in the SEC while we move to the night slate, Vanderbilt. Just an absolutely dominant win on the road at South Carolina. I had my doubts about Vandy both coming into the season and going into this game, and I really thought that the environment would have an impact on this game, but South Carolina clearly did not stand a chance in this game from the very start. They did have the game tied going into the second quarter and then never scored again after it was 7-7. Vandy wins this one 31-7. Diego Pavia continuing to show that he is a gamer. He will do whatever it takes for his team to win, including laying out some monster blocks. Got to give some credit to him for that. And Vandy is a team to watch in the SEC. They are back in the top 25, showing that last year maybe wasn't such a fluke after all. There is no team in the country that I'm more disappointed in so far than Duke. I was very invested in this team coming into the year. Thought they would have a great season in the ACC behind quarterback Darian Mensah. Unfortunately, he had to go on the road last night and play against his old team, Tulane, and it did not go very well for him. On the surface, this is a 7-point win for Tulane, 34-27, but they led throughout by multiple possessions, jumped on them 14-0 in the first quarter, and really never looked back. I think it's time I start putting some more respect on Jake Retzloff's name. I haven't been the highest on him. He's had a lot of turnover-worthy plays throughout his career, but he's doing a much better job of taking care of the ball this year, and he really is showing that he's one of the better running quarterbacks in America. Runs for 4 touchdowns on the ground, along with another 111 yards. So really just doing whatever it takes to win. Another one of these guys that are pretty gritty and make clutch plays when they need to. Arizona State is a team that I wasn't particularly high on coming into the year. I know they had a successful season in 2024, making the playoffs and returned a lot of production from that team, but I thought that Cam Skattebo would be a big loss for them. Now, they did lose the game outright last week to Mississippi State as predicted, but I think that is now saying more about Mississippi State than it is about ASU. I was very impressed by what I saw last night out of the Sun Devils against Texas State, a team that, if you remember back to last year, they were actually an underdog against when they faced off in the first head-to-head matchup. This time, they were a 17.5-point favorite. I thought that line was completely wrong, and it wasn't. Arizona State wins and covers. Their defense looked much better than I could have expected, and they've really gotten back to their true identity of running the football. 42 carries for 245 yards and 2 touchdowns. They've got a number of different backs that contribute in the run game, and also quarterback Sam Leavitt has been running more this year using his physicality and athleticism. Another impressive late-night win by the Cal Golden Bears as an underdog against Minnesota. Really thought that their freshman quarterback, Sanga Polutelli, would struggle in this one. As talented as he is and as high as I am on him, this was the number 1 pass defense in America coming into this game. Obviously, that was against bad competition for Minnesota, but still a very impressive performance by the young QB and his team. They win this one 27-14. Last game that I will touch on quickly before we move ahead and look to the Week 4 board and see if there's any early lines that we can take advantage of. Florida and LSU, I tried to caution people that this may not work out so well for Florida. It wasn't as simple as just bouncing back after the loss against South Florida. This Florida roster truly has all of the pieces except for the 2 most important, and that is a head coach and a quarterback. DJ Lagway was the number 2 overall quarterback in last year's class. This is his second season in Gainesville, and I really expected a monster year out of him, but he throws 5 interceptions in this game. Some really terrible decisions to prevent them from getting field goals or just maintaining drives. They really dominated this game in certain ways, especially in total yardage, but ultimately, if you don't have a quarterback and a smart head coach, it's hard to win games, especially on the road. LSU has some question marks offensively. They just don't quite seem in sync quite yet on that side of the ball. It's a good thing that their defense is playing at an elite level, though, which should carry them through the first half of the season, and hopefully down the stretch, they'll figure out that connection a little bit more between Garrett Nussmeier and a very high-level group of receivers. All right, let's go ahead and take a quick look at the Week 4 board. It is currently Sunday, September 14th, As per usual, the lines have dropped, and they most likely will move as the week goes on. We saw it last week in particular. Most of the big games had massive line shifts, sometimes up to 6 or 7 points. So it's important to get in front of some of these lines early and often if you can. One that certainly stands out to me is that Michigan is a favorite on the road against Nebraska. I was not expecting this. I thought Nebraska would be a short favorite in this game based on how they've looked in their first three matchups. Probably the best Nebraska team in quite some time. Michigan will be missing their head coach, Sharon Moore, for the second consecutive game due to a suspension. But once again, I actually think that benefits Michigan here. So leaning towards them in that game, certainly based on that opening line. I mentioned North Texas earlier. They actually opened as a short underdog on the road at Army. It is a tough travel spot for them, but based on what I've seen from these two teams so far, I'm definitely going to be on the mean green in this one. Army does have the win over Kansas State, but I'm not super worried about that one. Kansas State is just a mess right now. Very interesting out of conference matchup with Arkansas hitting the road to take on Memphis, a team that has exceeded my expectations so far, especially defensively. They played Troy this past weekend on the road, and Troy was a pretty trendy underdog pick, but Memphis took care of them 28-7 and should provide a real challenge for the Razorbacks in a true road game. Arguably, the Big 12 game of the year is this week between Texas Tech and Utah, the two top teams in terms of the odds to win the league at the moment. Utah right now is about a 4-point favorite in this game, which I completely disagree with. I do like Utah as a team, but I have Texas Tech as just a 1-point underdog in this one. I'm expecting that line to get tighter as the week gets on. Another one worth mentioning, purely just because of the line. I saw this number and alarm bells immediately started ringing in my head. Eastern Michigan, 0-3, including a loss to Long Island. And they are only a 3-point underdog now against the Ragin' Cajuns of Louisiana. It is a home game for EMU, and they opened at 6.5. This smells like an upset right here. One of the games of the week in week 4 is Oklahoma taking on Auburn, two top 25 SEC teams facing off. Auburn currently about a 5.5-point underdog on the road. Their quarterback is Jackson Arnold, a former Oklahoma Sooner. That will be a very interesting matchup with a lot of bad blood. One SEC matchup that has really lost some luster because of this past weekend is Missouri against South Carolina. If you look back to this matchup a year ago, this line is essentially flipped from where it was. South Carolina was about a 14-point favorite in the game last year. Now Missouri is a 13-point favorite in this one. We've talked about how improved Mizzou is and how much South Carolina is struggling, especially offensively right now. That could be a real blowout spot, but also desperation for South Carolina at this point. ESPN's College Game Day made the decision to go to Florida versus Miami. I think that was a very poor choice, but Illinois and Indiana would have been my choice. I think they should have gone there. This is a top 20 matchup in the Big Ten that could actually have tremendous impact on the Big Ten picture and the playoff picture. Indiana, I continue to be impressed by. They have absolutely dominated their first three opponents, and a lot of people just expected regression from them this year because it's Indiana, but they really have much of the same roster as they did a year ago when they made the playoffs, and in my opinion, a slight quarterback upgrade. Illinois is a team that I have been definitely looking to fade throughout the season, so I will certainly be on Indiana. It looks like the line has already jumped up just within the last 24 hours. It was down at Indiana -3. It is up to 4.5. I don't really mind what the number is here, so feel free and lay the points with Indiana all the way up to a touchdown, in my opinion. Talked about Arizona State earlier. I have significantly upgraded them after the game last night, and I would actually have them as a favorite on the road here against Baylor. They are currently a 2.5-point underdog. I will be on the Sun Devils in that game. All right, that's been a quick preview of the Week 4 board to go with our recap show. talking about all the best games in week 3. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on this podcast and share it with a friend or two. And if you want analysis of all of the rest of the games, be sure to join our Twitter space on Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We do these every week, try and interact with the community and give out a lot of winners. We certainly did this weekend. Started the day 15-4 before a couple of unfortunate losses in the late night slate. So we're hoping to have a repeat of that for week 4. But until that rolls around, everybody have a great rest of your day.